Hi and welcome. My name is Carmela Berthia, and I'm excited to guide you through ways that we can bring Western music theory into modern band classrooms to deepen creativity and musicianship. Today, we will focus on practical methods that respect your expertise as modern band educators and popular music educators and empower students to be fluent across musical styles. Let's go. So, why Western music theory? Why integrate it? Western music theory offers a rich shared language for analysis, arrangement, and improvisation that does expand students' creative vocabulary. This integration turns them into musical bilinguals and they're able to flow fluidly between genres if it's taught correctly, if we use it as a tool and not as a rigid system. Research shows that when theory is taught as a flexible tool and not as a rigid system, that it does enrich student creativity and engagement way more than limiting it. So think of a time when theory unlocked creative possibilities for your students. And what did that moment look like for your students? Or what did it look like for you? Has it ever happened for you? Okay. So now let's look at how to create a common classroom language. So we know music is not one language, but it's so many. It's a collection of dialects. Um, Western music theory just represents one of those many dialects. Our students come to us already speaking their own musical language that's already shaped by a lot of popular styles, but by centering classroom learning around students' musical expressions, their slang, or the cultural terms that they use, we build confidence and agency. This foundation is going to make it much easier later on to introduce Western music concepts because the theory becomes another dialect in their growing vocabulary rather than an alien system. Okay, think about language immersion, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later on as well. Our role as educators is to act as facilitators and translators who help students code switch fluidly between genres. So we want to make sure that we respect. Now, there, there are countless ways to think about music. Indian ragas, you have jazz, you have graphic notation, like so many of us use in our classrooms, and so on. Respecting these systems is vital, right? It fosters inclusion and it shows that students all have musical traditions that are of value. In practice, this means analyzing the piece by ear sometimes, using alternative notation sometimes, and inviting a student to share how their families or communities talk about music. I learned that way that some of my learners who were coming in as beginning guitarists were really truly advanced. They just didn't understand the way I was calling out chords, but they knew it from their own dialect. At the same time, Western music theory is still an entryway for AP, music theory, IB, and most college programs. To keep opportunities open, we do need to integrate it intentionally, right? So you might have a student, you might have students use Roman numerals, and we'll talk about some of the other things that we're gonna do. I know I have a wheel in my classroom sometimes that helps to reinforce articulation markings on pieces, and so we'll stop and we'll spin the wheel, and it might say to play staccato, and then we'll explain what that means, and so it becomes gamified, and it isn't just learning a theory concept, but there are ways that you can integrate music theory authentically into your program. So we talked a little about musical slang. Allowing students to develop their own terms and share from their culture is a great way to start. Musical slang empowers students to create their own vocabulary, right? So how do we develop it? We learn a concept, we experience it, we name it, and then we communicate it, right? So helping students translate, code switch, and invent musical slang encourages adaptability and ownership. So we may learn a concept. We might hear a chord, right? So we're going to experience hearing a chord. We hear the chord played. And if students have not worked with chords before, we'll talk about it. You know, how many sounds do you hear? Do you hear one or do you hear many? And then we can come up with a name for that. They may name it a cluster. They may name it a group. You know, whatever they name it, is what they name it. And then we'll use that in practice for the day and we'll communicate that back and forth. Okay? If they don't have a term of their own. Then, once they've learned how to define that term, we can revisit it with the actual Western concept, right? Remember that term that we learned? Well, that's actually called a chord, okay? That cluster is actually called a chord, okay? So a chord is like a cluster of pitches, 3 or more notes, and then we can talk more about it, but they already have the concept in their mind, and it's not alien language, it's just extending their own vocabulary. Okay, so you think about ways in which you encourage translation between musical languages in your classroom. Here I have a few that I know that I've used in my early years. There's a form of gospel notation, um, one that my students use now, the synesthesia, the blue and the green dropping down, and then of course our traditional notation that also has some lead sheet elements to it with the chords on top. Do you incorporate different styles in your classroom? You should. All right, learning through exposure and repetition. We want to start theory instruction by focusing on concepts that are accessible and meaningful within popular music. For example, intervals can be taught by using like Coldplay's Clocks, or Kanye West's Runway, or even the Interstellar theme. Pieces that would have clear, audible, intervallic material in them. Chord progressions like 1, 5, 6, 4 pattern. They have so many, right? So, yeah. So you can expose them to chord progressions and talk about what they are. Talk about the Roman numerals with your students. You can adapt them for levels. Beginners might have a more simplified motif or slowed down versions of it. Advanced students might analyze the full harmonic, the full arrangement of it. They might reharmonize a part. They might identify the theoretical features themselves after a while, right? But this scaffolding helps theory feel relevant and it helps it to feel exciting rather than it feeling abstract with learners. So when you're introducing these concepts, what challenges and successes have you encountered? Have you tried this, or how might you adapt this for your students' learning needs? We want to make it fit the concept. Once students once the concepts are chosen, you want to adapt or develop sheet music that fits your learner's ability. So you create the sheet music yourself. You can use a program like MuseScore. You can use Flat. You can use Sibelius, whatever programs work for you. Simplify the rhythms, reduce the harmonies, but include and incorporate those concepts that you're using in the sheet music so that way they're forced to, they have exposure. You're creating the exposure. You're giving them the opportunity to be exposed to the concept, right? And you want to encourage students to annotate their own sheet music, add chord symbols into the music, add articulation marks, or even create variations of stuff, the further your students go. Okay? Um, Think about creating safe spaces for them to create music improvisation. Peer learning is essential to making music theory come alive. You want to rotate students out. Immersion, language immersion is so important. Allowing learners to talk with other learners and to communicate as musicians is vital. It's how we learn as musicians, as popular musicians, and it's how they'll learn. It works. It helps. Okay? And so I hope that these things make sense to you that we talked about today. I hope that you can take these strategies, experiment, and tailor them to your context. Thank you. Have a great day.